Hey folks, welcome to this quick episode of Sound Decisions here on Passion for Sound. I've been asked recently about the various frequency response charts that I share when I'm reviewing headphones and IEMs. So I wanted to take you through today a couple of bits and pieces that's worth knowing when you're looking at my reviews in particular and reading frequency response charts from me. There is some general information I'll share about reading response charts from other people, but most of this is going to be focused on how to read what I share in my reviews. To get things started, let's have a quick look at a couple of the frequency response charts that I've shared in the past. Going into my folder here, and by the way, anyone that's interested in having access to all of these measurements, my patrons do have that. So you can click through to Patreon using the link down in the description, or at the end of the video there'll be a link pop up on screen. You can jump through there and join the Patreon if you want access to all of these measurements. Higher level tiers also can ask for specific comparisons of one headphone or earphone versus another. But for now, let's jump in and have a look at some measurements. So in the headphones folder here, I've got a few random measurements of waterfalls, which are ways of showing a headphone's resonance, if you like, over time. But mostly what I want to talk about is just frequency response. So if I go in, let's have a look at a common headphone, such as the Audio-Technica ATH M50X. So opening that up, this is a recording made on my personal headphone rig, and that's using, which I happen to have here next to me today, measuring the harmonic dyne Zeus, which is coming up soon. So my rig is this. This is the mini DSP ears. It is very much a consumer grade rig. It's nothing like the big chunky grass rigs that you might see on Headfile, somewhere like that. Those cost a fortune. It's not something that a small channel like me can afford. But it does provide me, being the mini DSP ears, it does provide me with some degree of clarity when I'm comparing devices. And so specifically, that's one of the biggest points to take away from this. You should only compare measurements I've made using my mini DSP ears rig with other measurements that I've made. Comparing it to what comes out of some of the much higher grade measurement devices out there is really not a good idea, because they're going to have their own resonances, and in the case of something like the mini DSP ears, it's not going to be as well adjusted for that as some of the much more expensive headphone rigs are. So the key takeaway here is only look at my measurements in relationship to my other measurements. So looking at this ATH M50X graph that we've got on screen, what you can see is a headphone that's got sort of lots of lumps and bumps, and it tails off down in the bass region here. Now when I share a graph like this on screen, one thing worth noting is I smooth it to what's called psychoacoustic smoothing, and I'll show you that shortly. But what's really important is within the smoothing process, what it's doing is helping to show you what you actually perceive. So the raw measurement, which I'll also show you shortly, can be very lumpy and bumpy, but our ears don't necessarily hear every one of those little tiny peaks and troughs. So in other words, when you look at my measurements, what you're more looking for is the overall shape and any significant pieces of emphasis. So looking at the ATH M50X, what this tells me is it rolls off a bit in the bottom end. It's got emphasis through the mid-range, and particularly in the upper mids here, through this sort of 400 through 1 to 2 kilohertz range. There's emphasis, and then there's a little bit of roll off into the treble, but not very much. So that's going to tell me that it's a slightly mid-forward headphone. That's giving me a lot of detail through the mid and treble, but may roll off a bit in the very lowest bass. And that's fairly true for the ATH M50X, but it also doesn't tell the whole story, and that's another big takeaway. Frequency response is just one part of the whole picture of how a headphone performs. There are other things like the way transients are delivered, the speed of the driver, the control of the driver, so how well it starts and stops the sound. All of that is very important, and a lot of that is not conveyed by these frequency response charts. So really the takeaway message is it's all about the shape, as I've already said. And if I show you a different headphone now, let's have a look at the DT1990 with its balance pads. What you can see here, this very clearly shows exactly what the DT1990 is all about, which is it's got a little bit of mid-bass here, giving it a bit of punch and dynamics, but most of the activity is happening with this treble peak. And that's really what defines its signature. So if there were little minor lumps and bumps here, it wouldn't necessarily define the character of the headphone, because it's kind of in line with everything else. What you see though is this big peak tells us that that's going to be really significant in its frequency response, and it actually is. Now I'm not sure when I'm going to release this video. It may be before or after my DT 1990 video, so I'm not going to go into detail about the 1990. I'll leave that for review. But essentially, this does tell you the general character, which is a bit of mid-bass punch, a bit of character in the bass, but most of the tonal characteristics of the headphone are skewed towards that treble peak. Let's look at one more. The Hi-Fiman Susvara here. This is another really good illustration of a headphone tonality being displayed by its overall shape of frequency response. Specifically, the bass being almost dead flat through here. Then we've got a bit of a mid-range bump here before it tapers off down into the 3 and 4K mark with a little bit more of a peak up around 7 to 8K. And what that's telling us is this is a headphone that's going to have a very linear presentation throughout the bass, so all bass notes are going to come across at the same level of intensity. There's going to be a little bit of emphasis in the mid-range area around vocals in particular, but then it's not going to get too sharp and too harsh in the treble because of this valley, while retaining a little bit of treble detail, and actually a lot because of the speed of the delivery from the Susvaras. And that's where I said before, things like transient speed and the way it manages resolution is not displayed here. But what it does tell us on the frequency response is that the overall tonality is not going to be rich and thick and warm because it's balanced by this bit of treble energy. So one of the big things I look for in an overall frequency response is having a headphone that's not overly skewed in any one point. And I'll show you a great example of what happens when things get too skewed. If we go to IEMs, I recently reviewed the ICO OH1S. And this is an example of an incredibly skewed earphone. So notice how low the bass is compared to how high the treble is. Now this might be slightly skewed by the measurement rig. I find the mini DSP is not particularly good for IEMs, but the point here is you see an earphone that is heavily skewed towards the treble. So this shape tells us the whole story. This is an absolute treble focused IEM, as opposed to something else like, say, the C Audio Yuma. The C Audio Yuma here, which is a bit more balanced, does still definitely lack bass, as you can see by this overall lower region, but the mid-range here is a little bit more lifted, and that's what the Yuma does present, is a focus on the mid-range, vocals, things like that, and then a fairly balanced treble with mids. So looking at this graph, I would immediately say this is going to be a headphone that's going to have a mid and treble emphasis with a lack of bass, and that's what it does. So that's really what you should take away. Whenever you look at the graphs on my channel, you won't be able to read individual frequency numbers because I don't put them on the screen. And the reason for that is I just want you to take away the overall shape of the frequency response. Don't worry about whether a peak's at 3K, 2K or 4K. Worry about the fact that the peak is in the lower treble or the upper treble or the mids or the bass. That's really what you think about. So I tend to break it down into a sub-bass region down here in the 20, 30, 40 range. Then we look at the general sort of mid-bass area, which is where you tend to get the punch. And by the way, the sub-bass tends to be the area that gives us the rumble. So you've got rumble down here in sub-bass, punch down here in the mid-bass area. Then we get the things like vocal qualities, overall thickness and weight and presence of the sound in the mid-range sense, up through here from anywhere from about 200 all the way up through to about 2 kilohertz is your mid-range vocals, what they sometimes call the presence region. Overemphasis here can sometimes make things nasal, sometimes can make them a bit boxy, depending on exactly where it sits. And then we start to get up into the treble area. So when we get into treble, we tend to get things like a drier sound, a harsher sound, a grainier sound, or a really bright, sparkly sound if it starts to get up into the top end. You'll also hear people talk about air, and that's coming from up here as well. So emphasis in each region creates different tonalities, and that's all you really should worry about with frequency responses. Unless there's some crazy dramatic peak or dip, everything else is about the overall balance of one thing to the next, and looking at it to see, is there going to be emphasis in rumble, is there going to be emphasis in punch, in thickness, presence, overall tonality of the mid-range, or are we going to get into harshness, dryness, or a very airy and bright sound at the top end? That's really the best way to look at it. Now for a little bit of a technical deep dive, and nothing too technical, let me open up the Room EQ Wizard. This is the software that I use to do all my measurements. Let's have a look at one of my measurements. We might open up let's have a look at the Focal Clear. Okay, so this is my measurement of the focal clear. I'm just going to make sure we're looking at it with a good range of balance. And so when I look at all my measurements, a couple of things I want to point out. I tend to put all my measurements in a scale of 60 dB through to 96 dB. So unless it doesn't fit on that scale for some reason, like the OH1S, everything I look at is on that scale of 60 dB to 96 because it gives me a fairly good scale. Now that's not relevant to anyone else's measurements. The point is I have a consistent scale that I always try to use when I'm comparing devices, because otherwise if I enlarge the scale, it's going to minimize the size of the peaks and troughs. And actually let me show you that right now. If I increase my scale to say 110 dB, you'll immediately notice that some of these peaks and troughs have been reduced. If I go in the other direction and I fit it to the data so it exactly fits with just a little bit of room at each side, all of a sudden those peaks and troughs look huge. So what I do is I keep everything to the 60 to 96 range, and that means that my vertical scale is consistent for everything I measure. And that way if I see a headphone with big peaks, I know it is bigger than other things I've measured. And if I see something that's very flat, I know it's going to be flatter than other things I've measured. And in other words, it's not being skewed by the scale. While we're here, let's also look at some raw measurements. So if I get rid of most of those, and we'll just look at the left side measurement from the focal clear. Now there's a couple of things you need to know here. First of all, this is what I mentioned before in being an unsmoothed graph. So all these little wiggles and jiggles, these are all the fine details of the movement of the driver, but also might be representing background noise in the measurement. So I'm not in a treated room here, there's cars that go past on the street outside, and any of those sorts of noises can produce these little wiggles and squiggles. And that's where I find that having a smooth signal is actually a better representation of what's going to be audible. To do that, I use up here, there's multiple smoothing options. I always use the psychoacoustic smoothing, and the reason for that is that it takes into account the way our ears perceive at different levels of frequency. So at lower frequencies, it applies 1 grade of smoothing, and off the top of my head, I don't remember the sensitivity of it, but it smooths some areas more than others, and it's based on the evidence available from scientific studies about where our ears are more and less sensitive to frequency shifts. So you'll see if I hit psychoacoustic and apply it, all of a sudden that's actually how our ears would perceive the sound coming out of the left side of a focal clear. If I remove the smoothing, like so, and we're back to normal. So that's the example of what smoothing does. There's no reason you need to see unsmoothed graphs. If there's a particular issue in the measurement, for example, if I just remove all of these, and I'm going to open up the Monolith M1060, this was a really interesting one to measure. Let me get rid of all the extras there. So if we just look at one side, this mess going on down here, that's something that actually is worth seeing. So that tells me that there's something going on in the actual movement of the driver. There's some resonance, there's some distortion, something happening there. And that's where if I do smooth that, you'll see this doesn't tell the full story. So this is a time that I would, and I did, show an unsmoothed version when discussing that issue, but at the same time, it's not something to get hung up on every single review that you need to see an unsmoothed version, because the unsmoothed is just as misleading as the smooth version can be, but in different ways. This would make you think that this headphone is all over the place with all these wiggles and jiggles and peaks and troughs, when in actual fact, this is the only section that causes any issues. Every other peak and trough is generally not an issue. And that's why I bring everything back to the overall shape of the actual frequency response overall, rather than an individual peak or trough here or there, unless it's very relevant. The other thing I want to mention while we're here, let me close that off, is the way that the calibrations are used to adjust the frequency responses. Now let me get something that's a little bit less all over the shop. Let's go to the Meza Elite. Now you probably definitely haven't seen this one yet, so I'm going to not say too much about the headphone. We're going to save that for the review. So this is the left-hand channel of the Meza Elite using the hybrid pads. And what you can see here is a fairly relatively flat, relatively smooth in terms of there's no major peaks and troughs, relatively smooth response. The trick though is knowing whether this compares to anyone else's measurements, because if you look at this on someone else's measurement, depending on the compensations they've applied, it might look quite different. and the compensation is the key. So if I go over to my measurement here, you'll see over on the left hand side I've got mic/meter L_HPN blah blah blah. That's the calibration I've applied. Now if I remove the calibration altogether, this is what, and I'm going to fit this to the data for now, not what I normally do. So this is what the normal uncalibrated response from the microphones in the mini DSP ears have produced. And when I say uncalibrated, what that means is this is exactly what those microphones have recorded, but it's not taking into account the fact that it's a headphone on a set of ears. So if this was how a speaker sounded in a room, you'd hate it. It would be dreadful. It would have this horrible treble peak here. It would have all of this kind of weird bass roll off and then this trough here. It wouldn't be a great sound. But the reality is, when we put headphones on our ears, things are very, very different. We're not getting the effect of, say, the wall reflections, what they call the head transfer effect, where you hear different sounds from the right speaker hitting the left ear and the left speaker getting to the right ear. All of that's gone. And that's why we need to apply calibration. The challenge is there's different calibration options around. So I can apply just with my Room EQ Wizard software, I can apply something like we're on the left side, so I could do what they call their headphone EQ calibration, which would give me this. And that's going to tell me how to adjust the headphone using EQ, and it's representing the information here in a different way depending on what my end purpose is. So that doesn't mean that this is the right way to look at it or the wrong way. This is something that's been designed to help somebody produce EQ to produce a flat response, or at least start with a flat response and then adjust as they want to. If I change to the left side HPN, so I think that stands for headphone neutral, that now gives me a whole different look again. So looking at this now, this is representative in my experience and how I use this. This is representative of how the headphone actually sounds because this is what I'm used to using. So what I can see here is a headphone that's got fairly linear bass, a little bit of a lift in the mids, and then it tapers off into the treble, but still has a little bit of sparkle and air up in the top end. But as you can see, every calibration I apply gives me a completely different shaped graph. So it depends on what calibration someone's applying and what the goal is. So the goal of mine using this HPN in Room EQ Wizard is to get something that looks pretty much like this. So you want a headphone in the HPN calibration to be fairly flat through the bass and then to taper off down into the treble. Now there's all sorts of target curves that then come into play. I don't tend to subscribe to any of them. I'm aware of them. I appreciate they can make great sound, but I tend to just want to look at a headphone without any reference curves over the top. For me, I'm just looking at it to go, what am I expecting to hear? Does it match what I'm hearing? Are there things that are too extreme or not extreme enough? Maybe everything's too flat and it's not interesting, or there's too much treble compared to the bass because things don't roll off nicely. It's all that sort of thinking. And so I think that's probably all that really needs to be known. For me, I use this HPN calibration. The headphones should always be mostly flat and then tapering off if you want them to sound pretty much neutral. And then when I go to IEMs, let me do that now. If I open an IEM measurement such as the OH10 is probably not a bad one. So looking at the OH10 here, keeping in mind, as I said before, the IEMs are notoriously difficult to measure, for me at least, on the mini DSP ears, because it depends so much on the seal that I get, the way the silicon ear canals work on the mini DSP ears. I find it tends to grab onto the tips and it can twist the tips and it can occlude the opening of where the sound exits the tip and into the microphone. So I don't always trust these measurements. I don't go into a lot of depth on IEM measurements. But just for those times that I do, I wanted to show you that when I take an IEM measurement, I'm using what's called an IEM diffuse field calibration. And again, this should result in a flat IEM in something fairly flat sounding. So this is the Eco OH10. As you can see here from the smoothed average, it's got this nice bit of linear clean bass that dips down a bit in the mids and then a bit of treble energy up the top. And I discussed that in the review. It's generally a quite bassy IEM, but it can bite a little bit in the treble at certain times. If I look at a different IEM, and instead let's have a look at the Mesa Ray Penta. So we've once again got the IEM diffuse field measurements going on, and this is showing an IEM that's got a bit of extra treble energy up top and then a slightly rolled off bass. Now I do find with the IEMs, the bass that I perceive is often stronger than the bass in my measurements. So that's why I don't put a lot of faith into this particular measurement system, but I wanted to show you this just to show that I'm using a different calibration file for IEMs, and therefore you can't even compare my IEM results to my own headphone results because they're different. And a big part of that is that an IEM is sealing the ear canals, whereas a headphone is sitting over the ear itself. And so all in all, the takeaway message that I hope you're getting from this video is that the key thing to look at is the overall shape of the frequency response, is to look for peaks, troughs, anomalies, that sort of thing, but not to get too hung up overall, and very specifically, not to compare my measurements with anyone else's, or for that matter, comparing other people's measurements with other people's measurements. So for example, if you go to headphones.com and try to compare their measurements to something from Clinical, you actually can't compare those two necessarily. Maybe if you're able to check and see they're using the same rig and the same compensation curves and the same scale, that might be possible. But that's about the only way you can absolutely make sure you're comparing apples with apples. And so what's more relevant, and we'll go to one now, what's more relevant is when you actually look at specific comparisons. So if I look at my recent ARIA versus Ananda comparison, this is valuable valid data. Both taken on the same rig, both on the same scale, and you can immediately see that the ARIA in green has the better overall extension to the bass, whereas the Ananda rolls off. But then what you can see is that the Ananda also has a slightly higher treble peak, and that means that the increased treble peak compared to the slightly decreased bass level means you're going to get the impression of a more trebly headphone from the Ananda. And so that's probably one final point to take away here, is that the different relevant peaks and troughs are also very important. Looking at the Ananda, you might at a glance go, oh yeah, it sounds roughly the same as the ARIA, it's just got a little bit more treble and a tiny bit of bass roll off. But actually the fact that it's got a slightly lower bass level here and a slightly higher treble level here means the overall tonality is shifted. If you were to draw a line through here, it would be on an upward angle, whereas if you were to draw a line through here, it's going to be flatter overall. So this is going to generally be more neutral. This is going to generally have a slightly brighter lean, this being the Ananda, the second one, sorry. So hopefully all that makes sense. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments below. I'll be glad to try to answer them. I'm also working on building a course right now where in a very simple and approachable way, you can learn a lot more about this for yourself. So do stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe if you're interested in that course, because I'll be releasing that hopefully in the coming months. For now though, I hope this has been helpful. As I said, leave comments down below if you've got any questions from what I've just shared. But for now, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.